My name is Hannah Reed, I'm 31, and I thought I was marrying for love, not strategy. What my husband's family never knew was that I'd inherited a $17 million design company from my grandmother. I kept it a secret, not out of greed, but to see who loved me for me. The day after the wedding, while the flowers were still fresh and my dress still hung on the chair, my mother-in-law walked into our suite with a notary, a stack of papers, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just a simple signature, she said, a signature that would have handed them everything. Tell me, if you were in my place, would you have signed or stayed silent and fought back? Follow my story and see if you and I would have made the same choice. I can still remember the smell of my grandmother's workshop, cedarwood, paint, and lavender. Helen Reed was the kind of woman who built beauty out of nothing. While most people in our small corner of the Pacific Northwest saw furniture as something to fill a room, she saw it as a conversation between the maker and whoever would one day touch it. She used to say, "When you create something that makes people feel seen, that's real wealth." Her company, Reed and Willow Designs, started in a barn behind her old farmhouse in Boise, long before sustainable design became a trend. Every chair, every carved tabletop carried her initials burned discreetly into the wood, as if she were signing each piece with quiet pride. As a child, I'd sit by the window and watch her hands move like music, steady, deliberate, patient. She never rushed the wood to become what she wanted. "You can't force good things, Hannah," she'd tell me, her gray hair tied up in a scarf. "You shape them with respect, and they'll reveal their strength when they're ready." I didn't know it then, but she wasn't just talking about furniture. She was teaching me how to live. When she passed away, I thought I had lost the last person who truly understood me. The funeral was small, just a few neighbors and her attorney, Mr. Jack Olson, a quiet man with kind eyes who had been handling her affairs for decades. After the service, he handed me a sealed envelope with her handwriting on the front. Inside was a single letter and a key. The letter read, "My dear Hannah, the company and everything it stands for now belongs to you. I've set up a private trust in your name. It will remain confidential until you decide it's time to open it. Promise me one thing, don't speak of it until you're sure who loves you for you." At first, I didn't understand why she made it sound like a test, but as the months went on, I saw what she meant. People treated me differently when they thought I had something to offer: favors, money, connections. So I stopped mentioning the company entirely. Mr. Olson handled the legal side quietly, setting up a trust called the Reed Legacy Fund, where all ownership documents were stored. Only he and I had access. Outwardly, my life looked plain. I kept the old farmhouse but turned the workshop into a small ceramic studio. I taught evening classes at the Boise School of Arts, shaping clay while my students laughed and made lopsided cups. They saw me as just Miss Reed, the quiet pottery teacher who drove a second-hand Subaru and lived with an old cat named Willow. And honestly, I liked that. I liked being invisible. But beneath the calm, the company continued to grow. Reed and Willow had become one of the most respected sustainable interior design firms in the Northwest, its handcrafted pieces now in boutique hotels from Seattle to Portland. I oversaw everything remotely, through encrypted accounts and trusted managers who had worked with my grandmother for decades. The firm didn't need my name in headlines, it only needed my integrity. Sometimes, I'd walk through Boise's farmers market and see couples admire a Reed and Willow lamp or dining set without realizing the woman standing beside them owned the brand. That anonymity was my armor. I had learned that real peace often lived in the shadows, away from the noise of greed and ego. Then one afternoon, while I was cleaning the studio, I heard music drifting through the open window, a soft, familiar melody played on an acoustic guitar. It came from the cafe across the street. I remember looking up and seeing him for the first time: Ethan Moore. He was leaning forward, tuning his guitar, laughing with a child who had tossed him a flower. There was something about him that disarmed me instantly. Gentle eyes, a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. We met by accident, or maybe not. He started coming to my pottery class on Wednesday nights, claiming he wanted to learn something that doesn't involve strings. He was terrible at it. His cups cracked, his bowls leaned to one side, but he never gave up. He'd stay after class, helping me clean brushes, telling me stories about his students. He was a music teacher at a local high school. Over time, our conversations deepened. He asked about my grandmother, and I told him she'd built furniture for a living. He asked if I'd ever thought of doing the same, and I laughed, saying I preferred smaller things, cups that could fit in your hands. What I didn't tell him was that I already owned an empire of handmade things. When he finally asked me out, it wasn't a grand gesture, no roses, no big speeches. Just a simple dinner at a diner off Main Street, where the waitress knew his order by heart. He talked more about others than about himself, and I found that comforting. He made the world seem safe again. I told myself that not every secret is a lie. That keeping the company private wasn't deception, it was protection. Ethan didn't need to know about the trust, not yet. He loved the version of me that made pottery in a small studio, not the woman who had inherited millions. And I wanted to hold on to that kind of love for a little longer, the kind that wasn't measured in balance sheets or family power. Sometimes at night, I'd hear my grandmother's voice in my head. When people show you what they value, listen closely. I thought I was ready to listen. I didn't know that one day, silence itself would become my only weapon. It happened on a cold afternoon in December, the kind of day when Boise turned into a watercolor, soft, quiet, and blanketed in white. Ethan had asked me to meet him at the park near the frozen lake, the same place where he used to play guitar for my pottery students during summer workshops. I thought he just wanted to take a walk before the storm rolled in. Instead, he stopped beneath a snow-covered willow tree, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and pulled a small box from his coat pocket. The wind carried his words gently toward me. "Hannah, you make every silence in my life feel like peace. Will you marry me?" It wasn't the proposal I had imagined as a girl, no crowd, no fireworks, no ring the size of a chandelier. Just us, two quiet souls who had found warmth in each other. The snow began to fall harder, sticking to his hair, his eyelashes, the wool of his coat. I remember thinking how rare it was to meet someone who didn't fill the air with promises, but instead left room for sincerity. I said yes, and the lake around us was so still it felt like time itself had stopped to listen. That night, while we drank hot chocolate by the fireplace, I caught myself almost telling him the truth about Reed and Willow, the inheritance, the trust, the empire built from my grandmother's hands. But then I saw the way he looked at me, like I was enough exactly as I was. A voice deep inside whispered, "Not yet. Let love breathe before money changes the air." So I kept my secret, not out of deceit, but out of fear that if he knew, everything between us would shift. I didn't want to test whether his affection could survive the weight of $17 million. Ethan's family lived in Dallas, Texas, a world entirely different from mine. Where Boise was calm and unhurried, Dallas was steel and skyline, ambition and etiquette. His mother, Evelyn Moore, was a woman who spoke like every word had been rehearsed. She ran a large real estate firm that bore her husband's name, though everyone in the industry knew it was her empire. The first time I met her, she took my hand in both of hers, smiled, and said, "So you're the artist. How refreshing." The pause before refreshing told me exactly what she meant. Dinner at the Moore house was an event, not a meal. Their dining room chandelier looked like it could light a ballroom, and even the napkins had a monogram. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, discussing business mergers as if they were family gossip. Ethan's father, Richard, mostly nodded and refilled his wine glass, while Ethan's older sister, Claire, bragged about a trip to Paris for market research. When they turned to me and asked what I did, I said simply, "I teach ceramics." Evelyn tilted her head. "Oh, that's lovely," she said, "something creative to keep you busy." After dinner, Ethan walked me to the car and apologized. "Don't take it personally," he said softly. "They've always lived in their own world." I smiled and told him I didn't mind, but the truth was, I did. I could feel the invisible lines Evelyn drew around her family, the kind that separated us from them. And I already knew which side she thought I belonged to. Still, Ethan's kindness outweighed everything. He was patient, gentle, and so unlike the people who shared his last name. He'd call me from Dallas, tired after meetings with his mother, and say things like, "I miss the smell of clay on your hands." When he came back to Boise, he'd sit in my studio, humming while I worked, turning my quiet life into something that finally felt full. When he asked me where I wanted to get married, I told him I didn't care as long as it was somewhere honest. He laughed and said, "Then I guess my mother's estate might not qualify." I thought he was joking. I was wrong. The wedding took place 6 months later at the Moore family estate, a sprawling ranch just outside Dallas, surrounded by oaks and white fences that seemed to stretch for miles. Evelyn insisted on planning everything. "It's tradition," she said. From the catering to the flower arrangements, her touch was everywhere. She even picked my dress designer, explaining that she'd already secured a family discount. On the surface, it was beautiful. The guests were perfectly dressed, the orchestra played beneath a glass canopy, and the champagne never stopped flowing. But beneath all the elegance, I felt something cold. Every detail seemed designed to remind me that this was her world, not mine. As the ceremony began, I caught sight of her whispering to a woman beside her, both of them smiling. When I walked past, I overheard the words that would echo in my mind for days. "At least my son chose someone normal. A teacher, not a gold digger." The woman laughed. Evelyn added, "And without money of her own, she'll stay grateful." I didn't flinch. I smiled the way I always did when I didn't want people to see how deep their words cut. But somewhere inside, a small part of me tightened, as if my grandmother's warning had just whispered through the wind again. "Listen closely, Hannah." That night, after the guests were gone and the house had gone quiet, I stood by the window of our suite, still wearing my wedding dress, watching the last of the lights fade from the garden. Ethan came up behind me, kissed my shoulder, and said, "You okay?" I nodded, lying through my teeth. He looked tired, happy, oblivious. I thought about the trust locked away in a vault in Boise, about the company that carried my grandmother's name. And I thought about Evelyn's words. "Without money of her own, she'll stay grateful." I smiled to myself, a small, private smile. She was wrong. Gratitude had nothing to do with dependence. My silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. She had no idea that I had already inherited the one thing she could never control: my grandmother's legacy, and the strength to protect it. For a moment, I let my head rest on Ethan's shoulder, listening to his heartbeat. I told myself to believe in this love, at least for now. But, somewhere deep down, a chill crept in, colder than the Texas night, sharper than the diamonds Evelyn had picked for my earrings. I didn't know it then, but that chill was the first crack in the fairy tale. The morning after the wedding felt almost too quiet. Sunlight spilled through the gauzy curtains of the Moore estate, washing everything in a soft gold that made it look peaceful, almost holy. For a brief moment, lying there beside Ethan, I allowed myself to believe that this was the start of something gentle. His breathing was slow, deep, the kind of sleep that comes after too much champagne and too much joy. I smiled, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, and tried to ignore the heaviness in my chest. I slipped out of bed and into a silk robe, padding across the polished hardwood floor. The house was enormous, echoing with silence. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hum of a vacuum cleaner, the clatter of dishes being stacked. When I reached the hallway, a young housekeeper appeared, her expression polite but uneasy. "Mrs. Moore," she said carefully, "Mrs. Evelyn asked that you join her in the reading room." Something in the way she said it, almost apologetic, made my stomach tighten. I thanked her and followed the long corridor lined with portraits of the Moore family. Stern men in dark suits, women with pearls and perfect posture. The weight of legacy pressed down from every frame. When I reached the reading room, the door was already open. Inside, Evelyn Moore sat at the head of a mahogany table, posture impeccable, a cup of black coffee untouched before her. Next to her stood a man I had never seen, a notary, judging by the seal on the table and the briefcase at his feet. The air smelled faintly of leather and cold paper. Evelyn looked up, smiled, and gestured for me to sit. "Good morning, dear," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. I hope you slept well. I thought we could take care of some quick paperwork while things are still fresh. I glanced at the documents spread neatly before her. The titles were bold: clinical, power of attorney, and post, marital financial alignment agreement. The notary began organizing them, sliding one toward me with a practiced motion. Evelyn folded her hands. This is all standard procedure, of course. Just a simple way to unify assets now that you and Ethan are married. It keeps things clear, avoids confusion in the future, you understand. Her words dripped with assurance, but every syllable set off alarms in my head. I sat down slowly, running my fingers across the first page. Legal jargon stared back at me. Transfer authority, joint management, marital consolidation of assets. Every line was designed to sound protective, not predatory. And yet, all I could hear was my grandmother's voice whispering, "Listen closely, Hannah." I looked up at Evelyn. "You already have a family accountant and attorneys, right?" "Of course," she said lightly. "But this is about transparency, dear. It's important that we all work together as one family now." "Ethan agrees, of course." I looked at her, then at the notary, who avoided my eyes. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "I appreciate that," I said softly, "but I'd like to review these with my lawyer before signing anything." For the briefest second, her expression cracked. The smile faltered, just slightly, before returning with practiced grace. "Oh, of course," she replied, her tone suddenly cooler. "If you think that's necessary." "It is," I said. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the morning calm. The notary pretended to shuffle papers, but the sound was too loud, too obvious. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, eyes narrowing not in anger, but in calculation. I could almost see her reassessing me, like a chess player realizing her opponent might not be as easy to corner as she thought. "Ethan didn't mention you had a lawyer," she said finally, voice silk but with a hint of steel underneath. "I handle my own affairs," I replied. "It's a habit my grandmother taught me." Her fingers drummed against the table once, twice, then stopped. The notary cleared his throat and began packing up his papers, unsure whether to stay or leave. Evelyn rose from her chair, still smiling, though her eyes had gone flat. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll continue this later. I'll let Ethan know you're being thorough." She walked me to the door, every step deliberate, her heels striking the floor like a metronome. When I reached the hallway, she leaned in slightly and said, almost sweetly, "Marriage is built on trust, Hannah. I hope you remember that." I smiled back, calm, unshaken. "It is," I said, "and trust is built on honesty." Her smile froze. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't a daughter-in-law to her, I was a variable, a potential threat to control. When I returned to the bedroom, Ethan was awake, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, bleary-eyed, and said, "Hey, Mom said you were signing something with her this morning?" "Just some financial forms," I said, slipping into bed beside him. "I told her I'll review them with my lawyer first." He frowned, half asleep. "You really don't have to make things complicated, Han, she just wants to help." "I know," I said quietly, brushing a speck of lint from the blanket. "That's what worries me." He didn't hear the edge in my voice. Or maybe he chose not to. Within minutes, he was asleep again. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. Somewhere below us, I could hear Evelyn's voice echo faintly through the hall, crisp and low, giving instructions to the staff. Her control reached every corner of this house, every voice, every decision, every lock. But what she didn't understand was that I had grown up under a woman far stronger than her, a woman who taught me that silence could be a fortress. I pulled the covers closer, took a slow breath, and closed my eyes. It was only the first morning of my marriage, and already I knew the war had begun. It started subtly, so subtly that at first, I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination. The tone of the house shifted. The staff, who had once greeted me as Mrs. Hannah with kind smiles, began referring to me as Mrs. Moore, but not the way they said it to Evelyn. With her, it was reverent. With me, it sounded like a title they'd been instructed to use for formality's sake, a polite way to keep me at a distance. The warmth in their voices was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of people who knew which side of power their jobs depended on. At breakfast one morning, I noticed Evelyn had begun assigning me a place at the far end of the table, away from the family discussions. She called it tradition. The men sit closer to the head so we can discuss business without boring you, dear. I smiled, nodded, and stirred my coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue like armor. Days later, while reviewing our bank app to pay a few art supply invoices, I noticed something strange. A transaction of $20,000 had been withdrawn from the joint account Ethan and I opened right after the wedding. The memo line read, "More Advisory LLC. Investment transfer." I stared at it for a long moment, my pulse slowing, my stomach tightening. It wasn't the amount that unsettled me, it was the quiet confidence behind the action, as though my consent had never even been considered. That evening, I brought it up gently. Ethan was in the den, plucking his guitar and humming. I waited until he finished the song before I spoke. "Hey," I said softly, handing him my phone. "Do you know what this transaction is about?" He glanced at it, barely interested. "Oh, that. Mom needed to move some funds for a short-term investment. She said it was temporary. I must have forgotten to tell you." "You forgot to tell me that $20,000 was leaving our account?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He looked up, smiling as if it were nothing. "It's not like it's gone. Mom's projects always make the money back. She's been doing this forever. Don't worry, she'll return it." I waited for a moment, studying his face. "Did she ask you? Or did she just do it?" He hesitated. "She handles the family finances, Hannah. That's how it's always been." There it was, that sentence. That's how it's always been. The quiet surrender of a son who had never been allowed to stand on his own. I could see the pattern now. His mother's approval was the gravity that kept him anchored, no matter how much of himself he had to lose. I didn't argue. Instead, I nodded, pretending to understand. "Okay," I said simply. But inside, something in me shifted. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I went to the small desk in our guest room and opened a fresh notebook. I titled the first page, "Records." Underneath, I wrote the date and described the transaction in detail: amount, recipient, Ethan's explanation, and the tone of his voice when he said, "It's just money." It wasn't about the $20,000, it was about the erosion of boundaries, one small act at a time. I knew this pattern. I'd seen it in other women, friends, students, even my mother before she left my father. Manipulation rarely arrives with raised voices or broken dishes. It comes disguised as family trust, as tradition, as good intentions. It asks for small compromises until you no longer recognize what was yours to begin with. Evelyn had built an empire on that exact principle. I began to see how she controlled her world not through shouting but through quiet ownership of everyone else's choices. Her power wasn't loud, it was systemic. In the following days, the isolation deepened. Invitations to family dinners accidentally got lost. Decisions about the house repairs, renovations, even what cars we'd use were made without me. When I gently mentioned that I felt out of the loop, Evelyn smiled and said, "Oh dear, we just didn't want to bother you with the boring stuff. Your newlyweds enjoy it." But her eyes told a different story. Ethan seemed oblivious, happy to exist in his mother's orbit. He'd come home with new watches, new shoes, gifts from Mom, he'd say, as if the woman buying his wardrobe were simply showing affection. When I asked him if he ever felt she crossed lines, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "She's just helping us," he said. "You take everything too seriously." So I stopped talking. I learned that silence was safer, sharper. Every time Evelyn spoke to me with that perfectly measured politeness, I smiled and recorded her words later. Every transaction, every change in tone, every missing invitation documented. I didn't yet know what I would do with the information, only that knowledge was the only currency Evelyn respected. One afternoon, while I was sketching in the garden studio, Evelyn appeared at the door, a cup of tea in her hand. "You're quite talented," she said, looking at my unfinished vase. "Have you ever thought about selling your work?" "I could help, of course." I looked up. "Thank you, but I prefer to keep it small." She smiled faintly. "You'll learn, dear. Small dreams only stay small until they inconvenience someone bigger." When she left, I stared at the half-shaped clays spinning on the wheel. Her words clung to the air, heavy and deliberate. She wasn't talking about pottery, she was talking about me. That night, I added another entry in my notebook. "Evelyn's control is disguised as care. Ethan doesn't see it, but I do." And beneath that, one more line. "Silence is not surrender, it's observation." From that point on, I stopped reacting. Every time she pushed, I smiled. Every time Ethan dismissed me, I wrote. Every time they thought I was being compliant, I was listening. They believed I was still the quiet art teacher from Boise, too gentle to fight back. What they didn't know was that silence had always been my first language, and this time, it was going to speak louder than both of them. A week later, I booked a flight back to Boise, telling Ethan I needed to clear my head and visit an old friend. He didn't ask many questions, he rarely did when it wasn't about his mother's world. He kissed my forehead distractedly that morning, already on a call with one of Evelyn's financial advisors. As the plane lifted off from Dallas, I looked down at the endless sprawl of glass towers and highways fading beneath the clouds, feeling the tension in my body loosen with every mile of distance between us. When I landed, the air smelled different, cleaner, freer. The mountains framed the horizon like quiet sentinels, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling watched. I rented a small car and drove straight to Jack Olson's office, the same man who had helped my grandmother set up her trusts years ago. His office looked exactly as I remembered. Shelves of legal books, old photographs, and the faint scent of cedar polish. He stood when I entered, his face lighting up in recognition. "Well, if it isn't Helen's granddaughter," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "I was wondering when you'd come see me. You look just like her when you're worried." I smiled, trying to hide how close to the truth that was. "I think I might be in trouble, Jack." He motioned for me to sit. "Tell me everything." I placed the documents Evelyn had given me on his desk, the power of attorney forms, the financial consolidation agreement, and copies of recent joint account statements. He read silently, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. After several minutes, he looked up, removing his glasses. "If you sign this," he said flatly, "they'll have control over every asset you own, including your grandmother's trust." "But the trust predates the marriage," I said quickly. "It's protected, isn't it?" "In theory," he replied. "But this document grants them legal agency over your financial decisions. That means if they get access to even one linked account, they can attempt to draw the trust into marital property. It's subtle but deliberate." I sat back, my pulse drumming in my ears. "So they were planning this before the wedding?" He nodded. "This kind of paperwork doesn't appear overnight. I'd wager your mother-in-law's lawyers drafted it months ago." For a long moment, the room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then I took a deep breath. "What do I do, Jack?" He leaned forward, clasping his hands. "You protect yourself quietly. There's no need for confrontation. I'm going to set up a holding company under a different name. Something only you and I know. You'll move the ownership of Reed and Willow into it, and we'll reroute all company funds into an independent bank. That way, if anyone tries to reach your assets, they'll hit a wall." "What should I call it?" I asked softly. He smiled. "Something that reminds you of why you're fighting." I thought for a moment, and the answer came easily. "Willow Haven LLC. "Perfect," he said, writing it down. "A safe place for what matters." How? Over the next few hours, we worked meticulously. Jack made copies of every document, scanned them into encrypted drives, and filed motions to update my company's registration. We changed mailing addresses, bank contacts, and communication permissions. It felt like building a fortress, brick by invisible brick. At one point, Jack paused and looked at me closely. "Your grandmother knew you'd face something like this, you know." That's why she left things the way she did, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right time. I felt my throat tighten. She always said the true test of character wasn't what people did when they loved you, but when they thought they could own you. He nodded approvingly. Wise woman. When everything was done, he handed me a sealed envelope. Inside is your new set of company documents, updated trust instructions, and emergency contact codes. Keep them somewhere no one can touch, preferably not in Texas. I laughed softly. I was thinking the same. As I prepared to leave, Jack walked me to the door. Hannah, he said gently. You don't need to fight them head-on. People like Evelyn thrive on noise. They expect confrontation, they feed off it. Don't give her that satisfaction. Just stay quiet and prepare well. Silence as defense, I murmured. He smiled. No, silence as strategy. The difference will save you. Line. The drive back to my grandmother's old farmhouse felt like stepping into a memory. The lavender she'd planted still grew wild along the fence, even after all these years. I parked by the porch, unlocked the front door, and breathed in the scent of dust and wood smoke. It was strange how peace could ache when you'd been deprived of it too long. I sat at her old desk and took out my notebook, the same one I'd been documenting Evelyn's actions in. On a fresh page, I wrote, Step 1. Protect Reed and Willow. Completed. Step 2. Observe, don't react. Step 3. Wait. Outside, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the fields. I thought of Ethan, probably sitting at dinner with his mother, discussing family matters I was no longer invited to. I wondered if he knew how deeply he was being used or if ignorance had simply become easier than truth. Before bed, I opened my grandmother's old jewelry box, where she kept her sketches of furniture designs. Tucked inside was a faded photo of us, me as a child, covered in sawdust, sitting beside her unfinished table. On the back, in her handwriting, was a single line, Build what they can't destroy. That night, as the wind brushed through the willow trees outside, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't destroy Evelyn or Ethan. I wouldn't need to. They would undo themselves while I stood quietly, holding everything they thought I had already lost. When I returned to Dallas, the air inside the Moore estate felt heavier than before, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. Evelyn greeted me in the foyer with a smile too wide to be real. Welcome home, dear, she said, her voice warm but laced with something metallic underneath. Ethan and I were just discussing something important. Why don't you join us in the study? The study, the same room where she had tried to make me sign away my autonomy weeks earlier. I followed her in, noting the faint scent of expensive cologne and leather-bound books, the hum of the air conditioner barely masking the tension. Ethan was already seated at the table, a folder in front of him. His eyes flicked toward me and away again, guilt flashing and vanishing like a shadow. Evelyn gestured for me to sit. Nothing serious, Hannah, she said, sliding the folder toward me. Just a quick discussion about property alignment. You see, the Boise house, it's technically under your name alone, correct? I nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. It's the house I bought years before we met. Exactly, she said, her tone sugary. And now that you're part of the family, it makes sense to optimize your assets. You'll save a significant amount on taxes and insurance if we add both your names, yours and Ethan's, to the deed. It's simple math, really. You'll thank me later. I opened the folder and saw the words Title Transfer Agreement printed in neat black ink. Beneath it, my address in Boise, the home I'd restored with my own hands. The home my grandmother had once helped me paint. The one place that had always belonged to me unconditionally. This isn't optimization, I said softly. It's ownership. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Han, she's just trying to help. If something ever happened to you, you'd want the house to go to me, right? I looked at him. You mean if something happened to us? He blinked. What do you mean? I said, carefully choosing my words. We're supposed to be equal partners, but somehow, every document I've seen since the wedding takes something from me and hands it to your family. Evelyn interjected smoothly. You're overthinking this, dear. It's just good planning. You'll see that once you're a bit more experienced with financial matters. Women often let emotions cloud. Evelyn, I said quietly, cutting her off. I teach financial literacy to my students. I understand exactly what this is. For a moment, her mask slipped, her smile flattened, and a thin line appeared between her brows. My son trusts me to look after his interests. I'd expect his wife to do the same. I leaned back, feeling the cool leather against my palms. This house, I said, tapping the document, was purchased before I even met Ethan. It's registered solely in my name, bought with my own savings. It will remain that way. Ethan frowned. Han, don't make this into a fight. It's just a house. The way he said it, just a house, made something inside me twist. He had no idea what that house meant. He had never seen me scraping paint off its walls, or sanding the wooden beams by hand, or planting the lavender that still grew by the fence. It wasn't just a house. It was the last piece of my grandmother's world that still felt alive. Evelyn sighed theatrically, rising from her chair. You know, intelligent women are always the hardest to make happy. They question everything. She glanced at me, her smile returning like a blade disguised as kindness. But you'll learn. Happiness is easier when you stop resisting people who know better. I stood, matching her tone of calm. Then it's a good thing, I said, that I don't need anyone's permission to be happy. The room went still. For a long moment, Evelyn simply stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet laugh, she gathered the papers into the folder. Well, she said, her voice cool and measured. I can see we'll have to revisit this later. I wouldn't want to upset you on such a lovely afternoon. She turned to Ethan. Darling, would you mind seeing me out? Ethan hesitated, looking between us, then nodded and followed her to the hallway. Through the half-closed door, I heard her whisper something low and sharp, though I couldn't make out the words. When he returned, he didn't meet my eyes. We ate dinner in silence that night. I watched him across the table, his jaw tight, his hands restless. I wondered if he realized how far from me he'd already drifted, or if he even cared. Afterward, he said he needed some air and disappeared into the backyard, phone in hand. I didn't have to guess who he was calling. When I went upstairs, I opened my notebook again. Under step 3. Wait, I added a new line. They will try again. When they do, I'll be ready. The next morning, Evelyn's car was gone, but the residue of her presence lingered like perfume, sweet, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Ethan kissed me goodbye before work, his words careful, distant. Mom didn't mean to upset you, he said. She just wants what's best for us. I smiled faintly. I know, I said. That's what makes her dangerous. After he left, I sat by the window and watched the Texas sun climb higher, burning away the morning haze. Somewhere deep inside, the fear that had once paralyzed me was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. Evelyn thought she was tightening her grip, but in truth, every move she made only showed me where to place the next brick in my defense. I closed the notebook, whispering to the empty room. You can take everything else but not the house, not the one I built with my own hands. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass panes. It sounded almost like a warning or a promise. That night, the house felt unusually still. The kind of stillness that made every sound sharper: the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of wood settling under the Texas heat. I was in my studio upstairs, glazing a ceramic bowl I'd started weeks ago, when I heard it. Ethan's voice, low but hurried, drifting from the patio below. The windows were open just enough for the words to slip through. She'll sign it, he said. Don't worry, Mom. I just need to talk to her when she's calmer. I froze, the brush suspended in midair. There was a pause, then Evelyn's voice muffled but distinct. I could almost hear the edge in her tone, sharp and commanding. Ethan sighed. I know. She's being stubborn, but I'll handle it. The words landed like a punch. She'll sign it, not we'll talk about it, not we'll figure it out together. He was reassuring her about me, about my compliance. I set the brush down, wiped my hands on my apron, and reached for my phone. With trembling fingers, I pressed the record button and let it capture everything. His voice, her faint but unmistakable responses, the final words that shattered any illusion I had left. "She won't risk upsetting you," Ethan said softly. "She's too polite for that." When the call ended, I stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. My reflection in the studio window looked like someone I didn't recognize, a woman who had mistaken patience for love, silence for safety. I saved the recording, labeled it Friday night, and slid the phone into my pocket. The next morning, I woke early. The air was thick and humid, the sky a dull gray. Ethan was already dressed, standing by the mirror, adjusting his tie. "Mom's coming by later," he said casually. "She wants to clear the air." "Clear the air?" I repeated. "Or finish the paperwork." He hesitated, then forced a smile. "Hannah, please. Don't turn everything into a fight." "I'm not fighting," I said quietly. "I'm just listening." When Evelyn arrived, she wasn't alone. This time, she brought the notary again, the same one who'd sat in the study weeks ago, looking as uncomfortable as ever. He carried a leather folder, thick with documents. Evelyn didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Good morning," she said briskly. "I thought we could finally settle this. The title transfer for the Boise property, it's just a formality, really. You'll both be covered under joint ownership. It's the smart thing to do." "Owen." I sat across from her, the sunlight from the tall windows cutting across the table like a spotlight. I could feel my heartbeat, steady but strong. "And if I don't?" I asked. Her lips curved into a practiced smile. "Then I suppose it's your choice. But it does raise questions about trust, doesn't it? I mean, what kind of marriage begins with division?" Ethan shifted beside me. "Han, please, just look it over." Oh, quote. I turned the first page, scanning the legal jargon that might have fooled someone less familiar. It wasn't a transfer of joint ownership. It was a deed replacement, one that would effectively list both their names and allow financial control over future transactions. The moment I signed, the house would no longer be mine alone. I placed the pen down. "No," I said simply. Evelyn's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "You'll want to think carefully before refusing something so cooperative. The world can be lonely for people who isolate themselves from family." "I'm not isolating myself," I replied. "I'm protecting what's mine." Ethan's hand tightened on his knee. "Hannah, it's just property. Why are you making it about control?" "Because that's exactly what it's about," I said, looking him in the eye. "Control. And you've given yours away long ago." Evelyn's voice turned colder. "If you don't trust this family, then you don't belong in it." I met her gaze evenly. "Maybe you're right." A silence fell over the room, deep and electric. Ethan looked at me, his face pale, like he couldn't quite process what was happening. Evelyn's expression barely changed, but the triumph she'd expected to see in my eyes wasn't there. Only calm resolve. I stood, smoothing my blouse. "I'll have my attorney review any future documents before we speak again. Until then, please don't bring another notary into my house." Evelyn stood as well, the smile gone now. "You're making a mistake, Hannah. Pride doesn't build families." "No," I said quietly. "But deceit destroys them." I walked out before either of them could answer. The air outside felt thick, the Texas sun pressing against my skin. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from release. Back in our room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. My phone buzzed with a new message from Jack Olson. "Documents secured. Willow Haven is fully protected. Don't engage directly, observe only." I exhaled, the tension slowly draining from my body. For months, I had played the part they expected. Polite, accommodating, quiet. But now the mask had slipped, Evelyn's, not mine. I had seen the woman behind the perfect hair and the flawless pearls. And I had seen the man beside her, torn between two loyalties and too weak to choose the right one. That evening, I packed a small suitcase. Just essentials, a few clothes, my grandmother's locket, the notebook. Ethan came in as I zipped it shut. Where are you going? He asked, alarmed. Boise, I said. I need space. He frowned. You're overreacting. No, I said softly, looking at him one last time. I've just stopped pretending. He didn't follow me to the door. Maybe he thought I'd cool off and come back. Maybe he believed Evelyn's version of strength, the kind that forces submission and calls it love. Either way, I knew I was done waiting for him to grow a spine. As I drove away, the sky opened up in a summer storm, rain streaking across the windshield in furious lines. But for the first time since I married into the Moore family, I didn't feel trapped, I felt free. And as the thunder rolled behind me, one thought echoed in my mind: it's time to end this game. The rain was still falling when I crossed back into Idaho, a gray curtain blurring the road ahead. I stopped only once at a diner off the interstate to grab coffee and send an encrypted email to Jack Olson. The subject line was simple: it's time. Attached were the recordings, the copied contracts, and screenshots of every suspicious transaction tied to the Moore accounts. Beneath it, I wrote one sentence: do whatever needs to be done. Jack replied within an hour. Understood. I'll initiate the trust protection clause tonight. You may want to turn off your phone for a few days. When I reached my grandmother's old farmhouse, the air smelled like rain and lavender. The wooden porch creaked beneath my feet as if welcoming me home. Inside, the house was quiet, exactly as I'd left it. I changed out of my damp clothes, poured myself a glass of water, and sat by the window watching lightning flicker across the fields. Somewhere between the thunderclaps, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. The fear had burned itself out. The next morning, Jack called from his office. It's done, he said. The trust protection clause is active. Any attempt to claim, transfer, or alter the ownership of Reed and Willow designs will be automatically frozen by court order. They'll hit a wall if they try. I exhaled slowly. How fast will they notice? He chuckled softly. Knowing Evelyn? Probably before lunch. 1. He was right. By early afternoon, my phone started buzzing, Ethan's name lighting up the screen again and again. Then Evelyn. Then an unfamiliar number, probably their attorney. I watched the calls come and go, one after another, until the phone fell silent. Later that evening, Jack forwarded me an email from the Dallas County Registrar's office. Evelyn had attempted to file a title modification request, an effort to include Ethan and herself on several of my holdings, including the Boise property, and one of the corporate accounts linked to the trust. The email was brief and brutal. Status: rejected. Reason: trust, protected property, pending legal review. Note: attempted filing conflicts with existing trust clause restrictions. Case ref #445. D. Reading it, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. I didn't feel victorious or vengeful, just quietly relieved. The fortress my grandmother had built decades ago still stood, protecting me long after she was gone. Evelyn had thrown everything at me: manipulation, guilt, deceit, and still, she had underestimated the one thing she couldn't see: preparation. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the crickets singing somewhere in the distance. The phone on the table lit up again, Ethan calling for the 15th time. I watched the screen blink until it went dark. Then came the texts. Han, please pick up. Mom says we can fix this if you just talk. I didn't know she was filing anything. Please believe me. You're overreacting. The last message made me laugh softly, but with a bitterness that surprised even me. Overreacting. That was the word he'd always used to make me smaller, to keep me manageable. I set the phone face down and let the silence swallow the noise. In the days that followed, news traveled quietly through the legal corridors of Dallas. Evelyn Moore's name began appearing in whispers among courthouse clerks and attorneys, a woman suddenly tangled in a trust dispute she couldn't control. For someone so obsessed with reputation, that kind of attention was poison. Jack kept me updated. Her lawyers called this morning. He said one afternoon. They were furious. Apparently, she's convinced you hired some powerful firm to block her. I didn't, I said, smiling faintly. Just you and a grandmother who believed in good planning. He laughed. Well, she planned like a general. By the end of the week, the financial pressure had shifted. Evelyn's attempt to move funds through Moore Advisory LLC was flagged by her own bank for irregular authorization, thanks to the freeze linked to my name. Every time she reached for leverage, the system pushed back, and through it all, I said nothing. Not to Ethan. Not to her. Not to anyone. Silence became my loudest message. It was the one language Evelyn couldn't manipulate. The following Sunday, I received a voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled, but thinner now, like someone used to commanding storms but finding herself caught in one. Hannah, this is Evelyn. I don't know what you've done, but it's unnecessary. We could have handled things as a family. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Please call me back. I'll look. I replayed the message once, then deleted it. The next day, another arrived, this time from Ethan. I didn't know she filed anything. I swear, I was just trying to keep peace between you two. I'm sorry. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He hadn't been a partner, he'd been a bystander. And silence was the only truth he would understand. One evening, as the sun sank over the hills, I walked outside to the edge of the property where my grandmother's old sign still stood, Reed and Willow. Built from love. I ran my fingers over the carved letters, worn smooth by time. This company, this land, this legacy, it was the only inheritance I ever wanted. Not the money, not the prestige, but the freedom to live without fear. Inside, I wrote one final note in my journal. Evelyn wanted obedience, Ethan wanted comfort. I wanted peace. Only one of us got what we came for. When the phone rang again that night, I didn't even look at it. I just smiled, turned off the ringer, and let the quiet expand around me like armor. For the first time since the wedding, I realized silence wasn't my defense anymore. It was my power. And somewhere in Dallas, I knew that power was already keeping Evelyn Moore awake at night. The courthouse in Austin was colder than I expected. Its marble floors echoed with every step, each sound sharp, deliberate, final. As I walked through the tall glass doors that morning, holding the manila folder that contained months of evidence recordings, financial statements, the rejected deed transfers, I felt an odd kind of calm settle over me. The storm had already passed. All that remained now was the reckoning. Ethan was already there, sitting beside his attorney at the long oak table. He looked smaller somehow, the confidence that once lived in his shoulders gone. Across from him, Evelyn Moore sat pristine as ever, hair smooth, pearl earrings gleaming, expression carved from ice. When her eyes met mine, she smiled, but it wasn't triumph anymore. It was defiance mixed with disbelief, like she still couldn't accept that her control had limits. My lawyer, Jack Olson, placed a gentle hand on my arm. You ready? I nodded. Let's finish this. Nah. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. Papers rustled, chairs shifted. The bailiff called the case number, and the world seemed to narrow down to that single moment, me on one side, them on the other, the truth sitting between us like something heavy and alive. Evelyn's lawyer began first, his tone smooth, almost theatrical. Your Honor, our clients maintain that Mrs. Hannah Moore has engaged in financial deception by intentionally withholding knowledge of substantial assets prior to marriage, assets now proven to be of significant value. He gestured toward the thick binder of documents on the table. This behavior constitutes deliberate fraud, and therefore, we request consideration for marital distribution under equitable claim. Jack rose slowly. Your Honor, he said evenly. If the opposing counsel had reviewed the documents with even the slightest attention, they'd see that the Reed Legacy Trust was established 3 years prior to the marriage. It is a premarital, independently managed entity under federal and state protection. Furthermore, my client has never accessed marital funds for its operation, nor has she commingled assets in any way. End of tree. The judge, a woman with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every form of betrayal imaginable, flipped through the pages. Mr. Olson is correct, she said. This trust predates the marriage and falls outside the scope of shared property law. Mrs. Moore, she paused, looking directly at Evelyn. Or rather, Mrs. Evelyn Moore, your attempt to claim it was improper and potentially coercive. Evelyn's jaw tightened. The faintest twitch appeared at the corner of her mouth, but she said nothing. Then the judge turned to me. Mrs. Hannah Moore, do you wish to pursue spousal compensation? I shook my head. No, Your Honor. I don't want anything that belongs to them. Jack glanced at me but didn't argue. He knew this wasn't about money. It never had been. Evelyn's lawyer tried once more, his voice rising. Your Honor, regardless of legality, concealing such wealth in a marriage constitutes moral deceit. Her husband had a right to know. The judge closed the file. There's no law against protecting oneself, she said coolly. And if moral standing were the standard in this courtroom, we'd all be on trial. The gavel struck once sharp, echoing. Divorce is granted, trust remains protected. All marital assets are to be divided per standard proportion. Case closed. For a long moment, no one moved. The sound of the gavel still seemed to hang in the air. Evelyn's perfectly painted nails tapped once against the table, the only sign of emotion she allowed herself. Ethan's eyes were fixed on the floor. When the judge left, I stood, gathering my papers. Ethan finally looked up, his voice small, almost lost. You could have told me, he said. I met his eyes, calm. I could have, but if I had, would anything have been different? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't hide it to deceive you, I continued softly. I hid it to see who you were when you thought I had nothing. Across the room, Evelyn stood abruptly, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. You'll regret this, she hissed, her composure cracking for the first time. People like you self-righteous, ungrateful you always do. I turned to her, meeting her glare with steady eyes. I don't think so, I said. You taught me something I'll never forget. Power built on control isn't power at all, it's fear. She didn't answer. For the first time, Evelyn Moore had no words. Ethan reached for my hand as if muscle memory compelled him, but I stepped back. Slowly, deliberately, I slid the wedding ring off my finger and placed it on the table between us. I chose the wrong family, I said quietly, but I didn't choose the wrong self. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then I turned, signed the final page of the decree, and walked out. Outside, the Texas sun was blinding, heat radiating off the pavement. Jack caught up with me at the courthouse steps. You handled that beautifully, he said. I smiled faintly. My grandmother used to say the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand. He nodded, handing me a copy of the signed decree. So what now? I go home, I said. Back to Boise. As I walked to the car, I didn't look back. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a heavy thud, sealing that chapter for good. The ring I had worn for less than a year now sat abandoned on a table in Austin, a small glittering symbol of everything I refused to become. The wind caught my hair as I crossed the parking lot, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Somewhere in that scent was freedom, quiet, unassuming, real. And as I started the engine and pulled onto the open road, one thought came to me, clear and steady. I had lost a marriage, yes. But I had kept my dignity. And that was the only inheritance worth protecting. When I drove back into Boise, the air felt lighter, cleaner, like the world had been rinsed of noise. The familiar outline of the mountains rose ahead, soft against the morning sky, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was simply going home. The farmhouse was exactly as I'd left it, quiet, dignified, a little worn around the edges but still standing strong. The lavender had gone wild along the fence, spilling over in untamed grace. I parked by the porch and stood there for a while, breathing in the scent that always reminded me of my grandmother. I thought of all the times I'd come back here before, defeated, exhausted, searching for peace, and how this time was different. This time, I wasn't hiding. I was rebuilding. The following week, I threw myself back into work. Reed and Willow Designs was thriving, thanks to the team my grandmother had trained decades earlier, craftsmen who understood the company's soul better than any investor ever could. Together, we launched a new project, designing eco-friendly interiors for community housing in Montana, where floods had displaced hundreds of families the previous spring. When Jack first mentioned the project to me, I hesitated. "It's not as profitable," I said, scanning the proposal. He smiled. "Maybe not. But your grandmother would have said profit isn't always the point." He was right. So we took it on. The days that followed were full of long calls, design sketches, and field visits to battered homes where people still smiled despite losing everything. I walked through half-finished halls, smelling of fresh pine and wet concrete, thinking of how my grandmother used to say, "Build something that helps people feel seen." For the first time in years, I felt seen too. As the project gained attention, magazines began reaching out, wanting to feature the mysterious granddaughter who resurrected Reed and Willow. I agreed to one interview, a small publication that focused on sustainable design. The journalist asked what success meant to me now. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "It's not about the size of what you build, it's about what remains standing after the storm." Oh. A few months later, when the project wrapped up, I used part of the profit to establish the Reed Foundation, a scholarship fund for underprivileged art students across Idaho. Every year, the foundation would sponsor 10 young artists, giving them the one thing I once lacked, the freedom to create without fear. Watching the first group of recipients open their acceptance letters, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't triumph, it was peace. For years, I'd hidden the truth of my inheritance as though wealth itself were a sin. But now I understood that it wasn't the money that mattered, it was what you chose to make of it. I no longer felt the need to downplay what I had or pretend to be less than I was. But I also refused to let anyone, ever again, define me by it. My worth didn't come from my grandmother's trust fund. It came from surviving the fire without letting it burn away my integrity. Life in Boise settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I craved. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, afternoons with work calls and design reviews, evenings with quiet walks down the dirt road that led to the river. Sometimes I'd pass my old students at the art school, they'd wave, still calling me Miss Reed, and it would make me smile. One spring afternoon, I finally decided to reopen my grandmother's old studio. Dust coated every surface, the scent of wood and oil still lingering in the air. I spent the day sweeping, scrubbing, repairing the windows. The sunlight slanted in just the way it used to when I was little, catching the dust motes in midair like golden snow. Out back, the small garden had long since overgrown, but a few stubborn lavender stalks had survived. I knelt down and began to replant them, my hands sinking into the cool soil. The rhythm of the work, pressing, patting, watering, felt like a prayer. When I stood up, my eyes fell on the old wooden bench near the window, the one my grandmother used to sit on when she sanded table legs by hand. I hadn't noticed it before, but carved faintly into the wood were her words. "No one can take what you build with love." For a long time, I just stood there, tracing the letters with my fingers. They were shallow but deliberate, the kind of carving that came from someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness, but from the deep understanding that she had been preparing me for this all along. I lit a candle on the work table and whispered softly, "You were right, Grandma. They couldn't take it, not the company, not the house, not who I am." As dusk settled outside, the lavender swayed in the evening breeze, and I felt a quiet certainty take root inside me. My story with the Moores had ended, but my grandmother's story, the one written in wood and clay and patience, was still being told. The next morning, I opened the studio doors wide and let the world back in. Orders from new clients were already waiting in my inbox, people who wanted authenticity, not prestige. And as I walked through the space, sunlight on my face, I realized that I wasn't rebuilding what had been broken. I was building something entirely new. Freedom, I thought, isn't the absence of control, it's the presence of peace. And for the first time since saying "I do," I finally felt at home in my own life again. The sky over the Boise hills was pale and clear the morning I drove to the cemetery. The air smelled faintly of rain and lavender, the way it always did after spring storms. I carried two things with me, a worn photograph from my wedding day and the freshly printed charter for Reed and Willow's new foundation. When I reached Grandma Helen's grave, I knelt and brushed the leaves from the stone. Her name, carved deep into the granite, still looked strong after all these years. I set the papers beside the flowers, then slipped the wedding ring from my finger. The gold caught the morning light one last time before I laid it gently on the stone. I didn't let them sign my life away, Grandma, I whispered. I'm still myself, just like you taught me. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of lavender through the air, soft and familiar. I smiled through the tears that never quite fell. Voiceover. They wanted money, they wanted control. But what they never understood is that my silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. I stayed quiet to hear who truly cared. And now, I've heard enough. As the camera fades, I stand before the new workshop, sunlight glinting off the sign above the door. Reed and Willow. Built from love. Fade out.